I remember the exact moment I realized he wasn't just curious. It was the way his fingers paused not on the top drawer, not on anything recent, but on the oldest file in the house, the one I hadn't opened in years. I stood in the hallway barefoot, holding a folded dish towel I didn't remember picking up, and I watched my son-in-law search through my past like he already knew what he was looking for. It was a quiet afternoon. The kind that makes the house feel larger than it really is. The clock in the living room ticked too loudly. The refrigerator hummed like it was tired. Even the sunlight seemed slow, stretching across the floorboards inch by inch. My daughter Rosalie had stepped out to pick up groceries. She had asked me if I needed anything. I told her no. I always told her no. She insisted anyway, kissed my cheek, and left with that soft urgency she carried since she became a wife. Since she started belonging somewhere else too. Her husband Baylor stayed behind. He said he had work emails to finish. I believed him. At first, Baylor was not a loud man. He didn't fill rooms with presence the way some people do. He was careful, measured. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it was always calm, always reasonable. I used to think that made him trustworthy. The kind of man a mother hopes her daughter marries, and for the most part he was. He helped fix the loose cabinet door in my kitchen without being asked. He brought me my favorite tea when he noticed I was running low. He remembered small things, the kind that make you feel seen without needing attention. But there was always something else too. Something I couldn't name. A quiet distance, like he was always observing, not participating. I noticed it most when conversations turned personal. When Rosalie would laugh and share stories from her childhood, Baylor would smile politely, but his eyes would drift like he was listening for something else underneath the words. At the time, I told myself it was just his nature. Some people are like that. Still, that afternoon, something shifted. I had gone upstairs to put away laundry. Simple, ordinary things, folding sheets, matching pillowcases, the rhythm of a life that had long since settled into quiet routines. When I came back down, I heard it. A soft sound, wood sliding against wood, not loud, not careless, careful, too careful. I stopped halfway down the stairs. The house felt different. Not empty, but occupied in a way that made my chest tighten. I walked toward the study, slowly, each step deliberate, though I couldn't explain why. The door was slightly open, just enough. And through that narrow space I saw him, Baylor, standing in front of the old cabinet, the one I kept locked for years until recently. He must have found the key, or maybe I had left it out without realizing. That thought unsettled me more than I expected. He wasn't rushing. That was the first thing that struck me. He wasn't flipping through papers like someone snooping in panic. He was taking his time, reading, pausing, selecting, like a man looking for confirmation, not information. His back was to me. One hand rested lightly on the edge of the drawer. The other moved slowly through folders I hadn't touched in over a decade. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not yet, something quieter, a recognition. The kind that doesn't arrive with noise, just a quiet certainty that something is not what it should be. I pushed the door open, not hard, just enough for it to creak. Baylor didn't jump. He didn't slam the drawer shut or fumble for an excuse. He simply turned his head slightly, then fully, until he was looking at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. There was no guilt on his face. That's what unsettled me the most. Only calm, measured calm. "I didn't hear you come down," he said. His voice was steady, almost gentle. I glanced at the open drawer, at the papers in his hand. Old documents, legal records, faded envelopes, things no one had reason to look at anymore. "What are you doing?" I asked. I kept my voice even. I have learned over the years that raising your voice too quickly only gives the other person time to hide. He looked down briefly at what he was holding, then back at me. "I was looking for something," he said, "not through something, not at something, for something." That word stayed with me. "For what?" I asked. A small pause, not hesitation, calculation. Then he closed the folder in his hands carefully, placed it back where it belonged, almost respectfully. "That's actually something I was hoping to ask you about," he said. I felt the air change again, subtle but undeniable. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't curiosity. This was intention. I stepped further into the room. "I don't remember inviting you to go through my things," I said, still calm, still controlled. He nodded slightly like he accepted that. "You're right," he said, no apology, just acknowledgement. That unsettled me more than if he had tried to lie. "I should have asked." He said it plainly, like a fact. Then he added, "But I wasn't sure how." There it was again, not guilt, not fear, something else. Something quieter and heavier. I folded the dish towel in my hands without realizing it, a small, grounding motion. "What is it you think you'll find in here?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked, not past me, not through me, at me. And for the first time since I'd known him, there was something in his eyes I couldn't read. "I'm not sure yet," he said. Another pause, then softer, "but I think it has something to do with you." The room felt smaller, the walls closer. The past suddenly not as distant as I had believed. I let out a slow breath. "You think," I said carefully, "that something in my past concerns you enough to go through my private documents?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer again, not hurried, not sneaky, and pulled out a thin, yellowed envelope. He held it between his fingers for a moment like it weighed more than it should. Then he looked back at me. "I think," he said quietly, "that there's something here you never told Rosalie." Silence settled between us, heavy. Deliberate. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, in the space behind my eyes where old memories tend to sit, waiting for the wrong moment to return. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to, because something deep inside me already knew. And that was what frightened me most. I had spent years believing that part of my life was buried, not forgotten but closed, filed away like those documents in that drawer, untouched, unspoken, finished. But standing there watching my son-in-law hold that envelope like it belonged to him, I realized something I should have understood long ago. The past doesn't stay quiet just because we stop talking about it. Sometimes it waits for the right person to come looking, and somehow Baylor had. I straightened slightly, held his gaze, and asked the only question that mattered now. "What exactly do you think you found?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned the envelope over in his hands, and that was when I saw it. My name, written in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. My breath caught just for a second. But it was enough, because Baylor noticed, and in that quiet, measured way of his, he gave a small nod like something had just been confirmed. "I think," he said slowly, "this is where it starts." And in that moment I knew whatever he had come looking for. He was closer to it than I was ready to admit. I didn't reach for the envelope, not immediately. There are moments in life when your body understands something before your mind is willing to accept it. And in those moments, even the smallest movement feels like a decision you can't undo. So I stood there, still, watching Baylor hold a piece of my past like it had been waiting for him. "Put that back," I said quietly. My voice didn't tremble. I made sure of that. He didn't argue, he didn't question. He simply looked at the envelope once more, then placed it gently on the desk instead of returning it to the drawer. That small choice did not go unnoticed. "You didn't answer me," I added. He folded his hands loosely in front of him, as if we were about to have a conversation over tea instead of standing in the middle of something neither of us had prepared for. "I don't think this is something that belongs back in a drawer," he said. There it was again, that calm certainty, not confrontational, not disrespectful, just firm. I stepped closer, close enough now to see the faint crease along the edge of the envelope, close enough to recognize the slight discoloration that only time can create, and close enough to feel the weight of memory pressing against my ribs. "That's not your decision to make," I said. This time there was something sharper beneath my words, not anger, but warning. Baylor nodded once slowly. "You're right," he said again, but he didn't move the envelope. Instead, he looked at me in that same careful way, measured, observing, waiting, for what I wasn't sure. "For someone who says he wasn't sure how to ask," I continued, "you seem to have made yourself quite comfortable searching through things that have nothing to do with you." That landed. I saw it in the slight tightening of his jaw, not defensive, just aware. "It has more to do with me than you think," he said. I let out a small breath through my nose. "That's a very bold assumption." "No," he said quietly. "It's not an assumption." The room felt still again, like the air itself was listening. I glanced once more at the envelope, then back at him. "Then explain it to me," I said. A long pause followed, not empty, heavy. Baylor looked down briefly, then back at me, as if organizing his thoughts into something he could say without crossing a line he wasn't entirely sure existed. "I noticed something a few weeks ago," he began. His tone shifted slightly, still calm, but more deliberate. Rosalie mentioned a name. My stomach tightened. He watched me carefully as he spoke, like he was studying every reaction, every flicker of recognition. "It was casual," he continued. "Just a story about when she was younger, something about a summer, a visit, a person she barely remembered." I didn't interrupt. I didn't need to because I already knew where this was going, or at least where it could go. And the name stayed with me, he said. Of course it did. Names have a way of doing that, especially the ones we try hardest to forget. What name? I asked. It came out softer than I intended. Baylor tilted his head slightly. You know which one, he said. A quiet statement, not accusatory, just certain. I felt something cold move through me, not fear, recognition. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't fishing. He was following something. And he had already connected more than I wanted him to. I don't deal in vague conversations, I said, steadying myself. If you have something to say it clearly. Another pause, then he spoke. Dawson. The name settled in the room like dust disturbed after years of stillness. I didn't react, not outwardly. Years teach you how to hold your face steady even when your mind begins to unravel. But inside, something shifted, something old. Something I had spent a very long time placing carefully out of reach. That's not a rare name, I said, too quickly. I knew at the moment the words left my mouth. Baylor noticed too. I didn't say it was, he replied, and then gently. But the way Rosalie said it, it didn't sound random. I crossed my arms, not defensively, just to hold myself in place. And that led you to go through my personal documents? It led me to ask questions, he said, and the answers didn't match. I felt my heartbeat slow, not race, slow, like my body was preparing for something. What answers? I asked. Baylor exhaled quietly, then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. That small movement felt louder than it should have. He unlocked it. Tapped the screen once, twice, then turned it toward me. I looked into public records, he said. Of course he did. You'd be surprised what's available if you know where to look. I didn't take the phone. I didn't need to because I already knew. Some part of me had always known this day could come. He stepped closer, not invading, just closing the distance enough that I could see a name, a date, an address, old, familiar, too familiar. This connects to you, he said, not a question, a statement. I looked away. Toward the window, the sunlight had shifted again. It always does, even when everything else feels frozen. People have pasts, I said. Of course they do. Then I don't understand what you're implying. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket, like that part of the conversation had already served its purpose. I'm not implying anything, he said. Another small pause. I'm trying to understand something. I turned back to him. And what exactly is that? He glanced at the envelope, then back at me. Why there are documents in your house, he said carefully, connected to a man Rosalie mentioned once, and why every trace of that connection seems to disappear after a certain point. The words were precise, chosen. Like he had rehearsed them, or at least thought about them long enough to make sure they landed exactly where he intended. There's no crime in knowing people, I said. No, he agreed, but there is something unusual about erasing them. That word, erasing, it lingered. Because it wasn't entirely wrong, and that made it dangerous. I took a slow breath. You're stepping into something you don't understand, I said. That's exactly why I'm asking, he replied. His tone never rose, never sharpened, and somehow that made it harder to push against. I didn't want to go through your things, he added, but I also didn't want to ignore something that might matter. Might matter to who? I asked. To Rosalie, he said. That landed differently, not as an accusation, but as a weight. Because everything that involved Rosalie always mattered. I looked at him for a long moment, really looked. At the man my daughter had chosen. At the man I had trusted. At the man now standing in front of me, holding pieces of a story I had never intended to tell. You should have come to me, I said quietly. I am here now, he replied, simple, direct, unavoidable. The truth of that settled between us, and for a moment neither of us moved. The envelope sat on the desk, silent, patient. Like it had been waiting for this exact moment to be opened again. I don't owe you an explanation, I said. No, Baylor said. Another pause, then softer, but she might deserve one. I closed my eyes briefly, not long. Just enough to gather the part of myself that wanted to retreat. When I opened them again, everything felt sharper, clearer, more dangerous. Rosalie doesn't need to be dragged into things that have nothing to do with her, I said. Baylor's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze did. A quiet shift. Are you sure about that? He asked. The question was gentle, but it carried something underneath, something that made my chest tighten again. What is that supposed to mean? I asked. He hesitated. For the first time since this began, he hesitated. And that told me more than anything he had said so far. It means, he said slowly, I don't think this is as separate as you believe. Silence again, thicker this time. I felt it settle into the corners of the room, into the spaces between words, into the distance between what was known and what was still hidden. I looked at the envelope, then at him. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not fear, not regret, something quieter. Something more complicated. The realization that whatever I had buried was no longer mine alone, and that Baylor somehow was already standing closer to the truth than I was ready to face. I think you should leave that alone, I said finally. My voice was calm again, controlled, familiar. The version of myself I had spent years perfecting. Baylor studied me for a moment, then he nodded, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. I can do that, he said, a small pause, but only if you tell me I'm wrong. I held his gaze, and for a second, just 1 second, I considered it, the easy way out, the simple denial, the version of the truth that keeps everything quiet. But something in his eyes stopped me, that same quiet certainty, the sense that he already knew enough to recognize a lie, so I didn't say it. I didn't say he was wrong, and that was all the answer he needed. He glanced at the envelope one last time, then back at me. Then we're already past the point of leaving it alone, he said. And as I stood there in a room filled with pieces of a life I thought was finished, I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. This wasn't even about suspicion. This was about truth, and truth has a way of finding its way out. No matter how carefully you've hidden it, I didn't open the envelope that day. That might sound strange. After everything that had just been said, after the name had been spoken out loud in a room where it hadn't existed for years, you would think I would have reached for it immediately. But I didn't, because opening it would mean acknowledging that whatever was inside still had power. And I had spent a very long time convincing myself it didn't. Baylor stepped back first, not dramatically, just a quiet shift of distance, as if he understood that pressing any further would fracture something neither of us could repair. I won't bring this up in front of Rosalie, he said. It wasn't a promise, it was a boundary. I nodded once. That would be wise. Another pause, then he added, for now. I noticed that, of course I did. For now implies you expect that to change. It depends, he said. On what? He held my gaze. On whether the truth stays buried or starts affecting her in ways she doesn't understand. That sentence lingered longer than the others because it introduced something new, not just the past, not just me, but Rosalie. And the possibility that this wasn't contained the way I had always believed. You're making connections that may not exist, I said. Then help me understand them, he replied. Still calm, still steady, but there was something firmer now, less tentative. Like he had crossed an internal line of his own. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached forward slowly and picked up the envelope. The paper felt thinner than I remembered, more fragile, or maybe that was just my hands. I turned it over. My name stared back at me in that same familiar handwriting, slanted slightly to the right, careful but never perfect. I hadn't seen it in years, and yet I recognized it instantly. That's the thing about certain memories, they don't fade, they just wait. Where did you find this? I asked. In the back of the drawer, Baylor said, under the legal files. Of course it was. I had placed it there myself, not hidden, not exactly, just out of the way, as if that made a difference. I ran my thumb lightly along the edge. Didn't open it, not yet. Did you read it? I asked. Baylor shook his head. No, a small pause. I thought that should be your choice. That surprised me. Not because I expected him to lie, but because I had assumed curiosity would have gotten the better of him. You've gone through everything else, I said. Not everything, he replied. His eyes dropped briefly to the envelope, not the parts that felt personal. I let out a quiet breath. I wasn't sure whether to appreciate that or resent it, because in some ways it made this harder. It meant he wasn't just digging, he was thinking, and that made him more dangerous. We stood there in silence for a while. The kind of silence that isn't empty, just full of things neither person is ready to say. Then, from outside, the faint sound of a car door closing. Rosalie. The moment shifted immediately, like the room itself straightened its posture. Baylor glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. She's home, he said. I nodded. Yes. Another pause. What do you want me to say? He asked. I met his eyes. Nothing. He held my gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod. All right. Simple, but not final. I slipped the envelope into my hand and closed the drawer, carefully, deliberately, as if the act itself could restore some sense of control. It didn't, but it helped me breathe. By the time we stepped out of the study, I had already adjusted my expression, smoothed out the edges, placed everything back where it belonged, at least on the surface. Rosalie walked in with 2 grocery bags and that familiar warmth that always filled a room before she even spoke. "Mom, you should have told me you were out of tea," she said, setting the bags down on the counter. I picked up more anyway. Her voice was light, unburdened, and for a moment I felt something sharp twist inside me, not guilt, something closer to protectiveness. "I told you I was fine," I said, stepping into the kitchen. "I know," she smiled. "You always say that." Baylor moved beside her, taking one of the bags from her hand. "Let me help," he said. Normal, everything looked normal, and that was the strangest part of all. Because just minutes ago, we had been standing in a room where nothing felt normal at all. Rosalie glanced between us briefly. "Everything okay?" she asked. It was a simple question, casual, but there was a flicker of awareness in her eyes, the kind daughters develop without realizing it. The ability to sense when something is slightly off. "Yes," I said. At the same time, Baylor said, "Of course." Our voices overlapped just enough. Rosalie paused, not long, just a second, then she smiled again. "Good," she said. "Because I was thinking we could all have dinner together tonight. I'll cook." "That sounds nice," I replied. Baylor nodded. "I'd like that." And just like that, the moment passed, or at least it appeared to. Dinner was quiet, not awkward, just measured. Rosalie talked about small things, a coworker who kept misplacing files, a neighbor who had started renovating at inconvenient hours, the kind of details that fill space without demanding attention. I listened, nodded, responded when appropriate. Baylor did the same, but there was a difference now, subtle. If you didn't know what to look for, you might have missed it, but I saw it. Every now and then his eyes would shift, not toward me directly, but close enough, as if he was reminding himself that I was there, that something had changed. And I felt it too, in the pauses between words, in the way my mind stayed half a step behind the conversation, in the constant awareness of the envelope resting upstairs, waiting. Rosalie didn't notice, or if she did, she chose not to say anything. And for that I was grateful. Later that evening, after the dishes were done and the house had settled into its usual quiet, I found myself back in the study, alone. The door closed behind me, the lamp cast a soft, contained light across the desk. And there it was, the envelope, exactly where I had left it. I sat down slowly, not because I was tired, because I needed to, because standing felt too uncertain. I placed both hands on the desk, then reached forward and picked it up again. The paper was cool, still. Unchanged. Time doesn't move for things like this, only for the people avoiding them. I turned it over once more, my name, that handwriting, that past. I closed my eyes briefly, and for a moment I wasn't in that room anymore. I was somewhere else, years ago, a different house. A different version of myself, a voice I hadn't heard in a long time, and a name spoken in a way that meant something very different back then. Dawson. I opened my eyes. The present returned, quietly but firmly. There's a certain kind of truth that doesn't disappear. It just waits for the moment you're forced to look at it again, and I knew that moment had arrived. I slid my finger carefully under the edge of the envelope, paused just for a second, then opened it. The sound was soft, but it echoed. At least it felt like it did. Inside there were only a few sheets of paper, folded, yellowed with time. I pulled them out slowly. My hands were steady, that surprised me, but maybe some part of me had always known I would be here again. I unfolded the first page, and the moment I saw the writing, everything came back, not in pieces, not gradually, all at once, like a door that had never truly been locked, just closed. I didn't read it out loud. I didn't need to. Every word felt familiar. Even before my eyes moved across the page, and as I stood there holding a letter I hadn't touched in years, I understood something with a clarity I couldn't ignore. Baylor hadn't found the truth yet, not fully, but he was close. Closer than anyone had ever been since I made the decision to leave that part of my life behind. And the most unsettling part wasn't that he was searching, it was that he was searching in the right direction. I lowered the paper slowly, my breath was even. But my thoughts were not, because the past wasn't just knocking anymore, it was standing in the room with me, and for the first time I wasn't sure I could keep it from reaching everything I had built since, especially not Rosalie. Behind me the floor creaked, soft, familiar. I turned, the door was still closed, but I knew that sound. Someone had stepped into the hallway, and for a brief moment I wondered if Baylor was still looking for answers, or if now he was waiting for me to give them. I didn't move right away. When you've lived long enough, you learn the difference between a house settling and a person standing just outside a door. This was not the house, this was deliberate, a presence, waiting. I folded the letter slowly, carefully aligning the edges the way I used to, as if precision could contain what was written inside. Then I slipped it back into the envelope, not hiding it, just restoring its shape. The floor creaked again, closer this time. I stood, not rushed, not hesitant, and walked to the door. When I opened it, Baylor was there, not surprised, not caught, just present. His hand rested lightly against the wall like he hadn't decided yet whether to knock. We looked at each other for a long moment. There are conversations that begin long before words are spoken. This was one of them. "You were listening," I said. It wasn't a question. "No," he replied, a small pause. "I was waiting." That felt more honest. "For what?" I asked. "For you to decide whether you were going to open it," he said. My grip tightened slightly around the envelope. "And if I hadn't?" He held my gaze. "Then I would have known you weren't ready to be honest." There it was again, that quiet firmness, no accusation, just a line drawn in calm ink. I stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind me. Some things don't belong in open rooms. "I don't owe you honesty about my past," I said. Baylor nodded. "You don't." Another pause. "But I do think you owe it to the people your past might affect." The words were careful, but they carried weight. "You keep saying that," I replied, "as if you already know something." "I know enough to be concerned," he said. Concern. Such a gentle word for something that felt anything but. I leaned slightly against the doorframe, grounding myself. "You're stepping into territory that isn't yours," I said quietly. "And you're guarding it like it still matters," he replied. That landed, not loudly, but deeply. Because he was right about one thing. If it didn't matter, I wouldn't be standing here trying to keep him out of it. I looked down at the envelope in my hand, then back at him. "What do you think this is?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes moved briefly to the envelope, then returned to mine. "I think it's a piece of something that was never fully resolved," he said. His tone had softened, not less certain, just more measured. "And I think unresolved things have a way of resurfacing when they're connected to people who don't even know they're involved." Rosalie, again, always circling back to her. "You're making this bigger than it is," I said. "Am I?" he asked. Another pause, then more quietly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like something you've been trying to keep small for a very long time." I let out a slow breath. This wasn't going to end with simple denials. Not anymore. "You don't understand the full picture," I said. "That's exactly the problem," he replied. Silence stretched between us. Not tense, just full of things waiting to be said. Things I had spent years choosing not to say. I straightened slightly. "There are parts of life that don't need to be revisited," I said. Baylor studied me. "And there are parts that don't stay buried just because we decide they should," he said. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was amusing, because it was familiar, too familiar. "I used to believe that," I said quietly, "and now," I glanced at the envelope. Then back at him. "Now I believe some things are better left where they are." Baylor's expression didn't change, but his voice softened. "Better for who?" The question lingered because it didn't have a simple answer, not one I was ready to give. "For everyone," I said. He nodded slowly. "But especially for you." That wasn't a question, and I didn't deny it. We stood there for a while, neither of us moving, neither of us pushing further, until finally I spoke. "Rosalie doesn't know anything about this," I said. "Not really." Baylor's gaze sharpened slightly. "What does she know?" "Very little," I replied. "Fragments, names, nothing that means anything to her now." "And you're sure it does?" he asked. I held his gaze. "Yes." But even as I said it, something in me hesitated. Not enough for him to notice, but enough for me to feel, because certainty is a fragile thing when it's built on silence. Baylor exhaled slowly. "I'm not trying to create a problem," he said. "I know," I replied. "And I'm not trying to disrespect you," he added. "I know that too." Another pause, then he said something different, something that shifted the ground beneath the conversation. "I just don't like the feeling that something important is being kept from my wife." There it was, not curiosity, not suspicion, protection, that I understood. More than I wanted to admit. "She's not in danger," I said. "I didn't say she was, but that's what you're implying." No, he said quietly. I'm implying that truth matters even when it's uncomfortable. I looked at him for a long moment. At the steadiness in his posture. At the way he held himself not as an intruder, but as someone standing where he believed he had a right to stand. And I realized something then. This wasn't going to disappear, not on its own, not with silence, not with time. Because Baylor wasn't the kind of man who let things go just because they were inconvenient. He was the kind who followed them carefully until they made sense, and that made him dangerous in a way I hadn't prepared for. What if I told you, I said slowly, that whatever you think you found it has nothing to do with Rosalie's life now? He considered that. I'd ask you how you can be so sure, he said. I am sure. He tilted his head slightly. Because you've decided it or because you know it? The question was precise, too precise, and I didn't answer right away because the truth was I wasn't entirely certain anymore, not in the way I used to be. And that unsettled me more than anything he had said so far. I think you should stop looking, I said finally. Baylor's expression softened, not in agreement, in understanding. I can't promise that, he said. Of course he couldn't. And I won't go behind your back again, he added. That wasn't right, a small pause, but I also won't ignore something that feels important. I nodded once, that was fair, uncomfortable, but fair. From the other end of the hallway, Rosalie's voice drifted toward us. Are you two having a serious conversation without me? She called lightly, the moment shifted instantly, like a curtain being drawn. Baylor glanced toward the sound, then back at me. A silent question passed between us. What now? I slipped the envelope behind me out of view. Just talking, I called back. About what? Rosalie asked, stepping into the hallway, her eyes moved between us. Curious, open, unaware. Nothing interesting, I said. A small lie, a necessary one, she smiled. Those are usually the conversations that are the most interesting. Baylor let out a quiet breath beside me. Just how's things, he added. Rosalie looked at him for a second longer than usual, then nodded. All right, she said. Well, I'm making tea, you both want some? Yes, I said. Sure, Baylor replied, and just like that the moment closed on the surface. But as Rosalie turned and walked back toward the kitchen, I felt it. That quiet shift again. That sense that something had already begun moving and wouldn't stop just because we pretended everything was fine. Baylor stepped back slightly, creating space, not avoiding, just allowing. I meant what I said, he murmured. So did I replied. We held each other's gaze for one last moment, then he nodded and walked toward the kitchen, leaving me alone in the hallway with the envelope and everything it carried. I returned to the study. Closed the door, sat down again. The lamp still cast that same soft light, unchanged, steady, unlike everything else. I placed the envelope on the desk, opened it again, and this time I didn't hesitate. I unfolded the letter fully, let my eyes move across the words, slowly, carefully. And as I read, something became clear in a way it hadn't before, not because the words had changed, but because I had. What once felt like a closed chapter now felt like something unfinished, something that hadn't ended the way I told myself it had, and more importantly, something that might not have stayed as far in the past as I believed. I lowered the paper slightly, my breath steady, but my thoughts sharper now because Baylor wasn't just asking questions, he was asking the right ones, and that meant one thing: the truth wasn't just buried. It was still connected, somehow, somewhere. I looked down at the signature at the bottom of the letter, that name, Dawson, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to consider something I had refused to think about before. What if the past I had hidden wasn't just mine to hide? And that question stayed with me long after the room fell quiet again. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed with my eyes closed, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the night air, the kind of sounds that usually comfort me, but not that night. That night, every sound felt like a reminder that something had shifted, that something I had kept still for years had begun to move. I got up just before dawn. The sky outside was still pale, not fully awake, that soft in-between light that makes everything feel suspended. I made tea, out of habit more than need. The kettle clicked softly. The steam rose in slow curls. The familiar routine grounded me in a way nothing else could. I wrapped my hands around the cup and stood by the window, and for a moment I let myself remember, not all of it, just enough. A different house, a different version of me. And a man who had once spoken my name like it belonged somewhere, Dawson, Even thinking it now felt unusual, like saying a word in a language I hadn't used in years, but the feeling attached to it that hadn't disappeared, it had only been quiet. Mom. Rosalie's voice came from behind me, soft with sleep. I turned slightly. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, her hair loosely tied, her expression still half in dreams. "You're up early," she said. "I could say the same to you," I replied. She smiled faintly and walked in, reaching for a glass. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Neither could I, but I didn't say that. Instead, I watched her for a moment. The way she moved through the kitchen, the way she absent-mindedly tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Small things, familiar things, and suddenly I saw it, not clearly, not completely, but enough to make my chest tighten. A resemblance, not obvious, not something anyone would notice at first glance, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. I looked away, quickly. "Do you want tea?" I asked. "Please," she said, sitting down at the table. I poured her a cup, set it in front of her, and for a moment we just sat there, quiet, comfortable, the way we always had been. "Is everything okay?" she asked after a while. There it was again, that quiet awareness. "I'm fine," I said. She studied me, not suspicious, just attentive. "You and Baylor seemed a little off yesterday," she said, carefully, choosing her words. I took a sip of my tea, bought myself a second. "We were just talking," I said. "About what? Old things?" She tilted her head slightly. "What kind of old things?" I held her gaze. "Things that don't really matter anymore." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push, not yet. "That sounds like the kind of things that usually do matter," she said softly. I almost smiled. She had always been perceptive, even as a child, especially as a child. "Not everything needs to be brought back into the present," I said. Rosalie looked down at her tea. "Then back at me?" "Sometimes it comes back whether we want it to or not," she said. The words were simple, but they landed heavier than she realized. I nodded once. "Yes," I said quietly. "Sometimes it does." Baylor joined us a few minutes later, dressed, composed. Like nothing had changed. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Rosalie replied. I gave a small nod. He poured himself coffee, sat down across from us, and for a moment everything looked normal again. 3 people at a table, morning light, warm cups in hand, but underneath that there was something else. Something unspoken, and all 3 of us felt it in different ways. "I have to stop by the office later," Rosalie said. "Just for a few hours." Baylor nodded. "I can drive you." "No, it's okay, I'll take the car," she said. "You said you had work to finish, right?" A brief glance passed between us, quick, subtle. "Yes," Baylor said. "I do." Rosalie smiled. "All right, I won't be long." She stood, picked up her cup, then leaned down and kissed my cheek. "I'll see you later, Mom." "Drive safe," I said. "I always do," she smiled, and just like that she was gone. The silence that followed was different, heavier, more direct. Baylor didn't speak right away. Neither did I. We both knew this conversation wasn't finished. It had only paused. "You read it," he said finally, not a question. "No point pretending otherwise," I replied. He nodded. "What did it say?" I looked at him, measured. "You're asking a question you already have an answer to, not the full answer," he said. "No," I agreed. "Not the full one." Another pause, then I stood. "Come with me," I said. His expression shifted slightly, surprise but not hesitation. He followed. We walked into the study, the same room, the same desk, the same quiet weight of things left unsaid. I placed the envelope on the table, didn't hand it to him, just set it there. "I'm going to tell you something," I said. My voice was steady, but it felt different, less guarded, more deliberate. "Not because you went looking," I added, "but because you won't stop." He didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't move. He just listened, the way he always had, carefully, fully. "Dawson was someone I knew a long time ago," I began, simple, true, but incomplete. I could feel that already. "We were close," I said, still true, still not enough. Baylor's gaze didn't waver. "How close?" he asked. There it was, the part that matters, the part people always circle back to. I held his gaze. "We were going to build a life together," I said. The words settled between us, heavy, clear, unavoidable. "And then?" he asked. "And then we didn't." Another pause, but this one held more memory, more weight. "Things changed," I said. "How?" I looked at the envelope, then back at him, in ways that don't need to be revisited. Baylor's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm willing to give right now." Silence. Then, "Did Rosalie know him?" he asked. My chest tightened. "No," the answer came quickly, firmly, because that part at least I had always believed was true. Baylor watched me carefully. "And you're sure about that?" Yes, another pause, then he asked the question I knew was coming, the one that had been sitting just beneath everything else. Then why does it feel like this still connects to her? The room felt smaller again, the walls closer. Because that question. That was the one I couldn't answer with certainty anymore. I don't know, I said, and for the first time that wasn't a controlled response, that was the truth. Baylor took a slow breath. I'm not trying to dig into your past for no reason, he said, I know. But something about this doesn't sit right. I nodded, I can see that. He glanced at the envelope, then back at me. Is there anything in there, he asked carefully, that could explain that feeling? I hesitated, not because I didn't know, but because I did. And saying it out loud would make it real in a way I couldn't take back. There are things in there I chose not to act on, I said. His expression shifted slightly. How long ago? A long time. And you're certain they stayed in the past? I didn't answer right away because certainty was no longer something I could claim so easily. I believed they did, I said, and that was the closest I could get to honesty. Baylor nodded slowly, not satisfied but understanding. We need to be careful with this, he said. We. Yes, he replied, a small pause, because whatever this is, it doesn't just belong to you anymore. That truth landed quietly but firmly, and I couldn't argue with it, not anymore. I looked at the envelope one last time, then back at him. I'm not ready to tell Rosalie anything, I said. I understand. But if this goes any further, he nodded, then we'll have to. The words felt heavy, unavoidable, and for the first time since this began, we were no longer standing on opposite sides. We were standing in the same place, facing something neither of us fully understood yet. And as I stood there in that quiet room filled with old paper and older choices, I realized something with a clarity I couldn't ignore. The past wasn't just resurfacing, it was unfolding. Piece by piece, and whether I was ready or not, it was moving toward something that would no longer stay contained. I just didn't know yet how much it was going to take with it. The day moved forward, but it didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. There are days when time carries you gently, and then there are days when it feels like you're being pulled step by step toward something you didn't choose. This was the second kind. Rosalie returned just after noon. She walked in with that same easy energy, keys in one hand, her bag slipping slightly from her shoulder. I'm back, she called. Her voice filled the house in a way that always made it feel complete. I was in the living room. Baylor was in the kitchen. We both answered at the same time. Welcome back. Hey, again that small overlap, again that flicker in her eyes. She noticed, of course she did. You two are in sync today, she said lightly, setting her things down. Baylor smiled. Or we've just had a lot of time to talk. There it was, not a lie but not the truth either. Rosalie looked between us again, longer this time. What did I miss? She asked. I stood, walked toward her. Nothing that concerns you, I said gently. She frowned slightly. That's a strange way to answer that. It's an honest one. She held my gaze, and for a moment I saw it, that quiet shift, the moment curiosity becomes something else, something more alert. Okay, she said slowly, but she didn't look convinced. The afternoon passed in fragments, small conversations, half-finished thoughts. Rosalie tried to keep things light, but I could see it, the way her attention kept returning to us. To me, to Baylor, and to whatever we weren't saying. Baylor stayed composed, careful, measured. He didn't push, didn't hint. But there was a new awareness in him now, a sense that he was no longer just observing but waiting for something to reveal itself, or for me to decide that it should. It happened just before dinner, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. The way most important things do. Rosalie was in the study. I hadn't noticed when she went in. I only realized it when I heard her voice. Mom, there was something in it, not fear, not yet, but something close to it. I stood immediately. Baylor looked up from where he was sitting. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We both moved toward the sound. Rosalie stood by the desk. The envelope was in her hands. Open, the letter halfway unfolded. My chest tightened, not sharply, just steadily. Like something I had been holding in place had finally shifted beyond my control. I was looking for a pen, she said. Her voice was softer now, more careful. I didn't mean to go through anything, but this was just here. Of course it was. I had left it there, not hidden, not protected, and now it had found its way to her. What is this? She asked. I stepped closer. Baylor stayed just behind me, not intervening, not retreating, present, always present. It's old, I said. That's not what I asked. Her eyes met mine, and there it was, The moment I had been avoiding, not just with Baylor, but for years. What is it? She repeated. I glanced briefly at the letter in her hand, then back at her. It's a letter, I said, her expression tightened slightly. I can see that. A pause. From who? Silence, heavy, unavoidable. Baylor didn't speak. He didn't need to. This wasn't his moment anymore. This was mine, and hers. From someone I knew a long time ago, I said. Rosalie studied my face, looking for something, a crack. A hesitation, anything. What kind of someone? She asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything. I took a slow breath. The kind you don't forget, I said. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. And you kept this? She asked. Yes. Why? Because I couldn't let go, because some things don't end cleanly, because part of me wasn't ready to close that door completely, but I didn't say any of that. I had my reasons, I said. Her gaze didn't soften, it sharpened. Does Dad know about this? The question landed quietly, but it carried weight. No, I said. Another pause. Did he ever? No. Rosalie looked down at the letter, then back at me. And you never thought to tell him? That part of my life was over, I said. Her voice lowered slightly. But you kept the letter? I didn't answer because she was right and we both knew it. Baylor shifted slightly behind me, not stepping forward, just adjusting his position. Rosalie noticed. Her eyes flicked to him. Do you know about this? She asked. A dangerous question. One that could change the direction of everything. Baylor hesitated, just briefly, then he said, I know a little. Rosalie's expression changed, not anger, not yet, something more complicated. You knew and you didn't tell me? She asked. I wasn't sure it was my place, he said. And now, she pressed. He met her gaze. I think it is. Silence again, this time heavier, because now all three of us were standing in it. Rosalie looked back at me, her eyes searching. Why does this feel like something I should already know? She asked. The question struck deeper than the others, because it touched something I had tried very carefully to keep separate. It's not, I said, but my voice wasn't as certain. She noticed. Of course she did. You hesitated, she said. I didn't. You did. A pause. Then softer, Mom, what is this really about? There it was, the question that didn't ask for details, it asked for truth, and truth is rarely simple. I looked at her, at my daughter, the person I had tried to protect from things she never needed to carry. And for the first time, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider fully before. Maybe it wasn't just about protecting her. Maybe it was also about protecting myself from the consequences of telling her. It's about a time in my life before you were born, I said slowly. Rosalie's expression didn't change. But it doesn't feel like it stayed there, she replied. The room felt still. Even the air seemed to pause. What makes you say that? I asked. She looked down at the letter again, then back at me. I don't know, she said, a small pause, but something about this feels close. Close, that word, it settled into the space between us, and it refused to move. Baylor stepped forward then, not taking over. Just standing beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. I felt the same thing, he said quietly. Rosalie glanced at him, then back at me. So what are we missing? She asked. And there it was, the moment where everything could shift. The moment where silence could no longer hold the weight of what it was trying to contain. I looked at the letter, at the name written at the bottom, at the past I had tried to keep distant, and I realized. There was no way to answer her question without opening a door I had kept closed for years. I need time, I said. Rosalie's expression fell slightly. Time for what? To explain this the right way. Her voice tightened. There's a wrong way, yes. A pause, and we're very close to it right now. She held my gaze, searching, trying to understand, trying to decide whether to push or wait, and I could see it, the conflict in her, the part of her that trusted me. And the part that felt something was being kept from her. Finally, she nodded, not fully satisfied, but willing. Okay, she said quietly, but not too much time. I understand. She folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the desk. A small, deliberate act, like she was acknowledging its importance without claiming it yet. As she stepped away, I felt it, that shift again, but this time it wasn't just between Baylor and me, it was between all of us. Something had been uncovered, not fully, not completely. But enough to change the shape of what came next. And as I stood there, watching my daughter walk out of that room with questions I could no longer keep from her, I understood something with a clarity I couldn't ignore. The truth was no longer waiting. It was already here, and whatever came next wouldn't just belong to me anymore. That evening did not settle the way evenings usually do. There was no quiet drift into routine, no soft unwinding of the day. Instead, everything felt suspended. Rosalie moved through the house more slowly. Not distracted, but focused in a different way, as if she were listening to something underneath everything we said. Baylor stayed close but not overbearing, present without pressing, and I carried the weight of something I could no longer delay. Dinner was barely touched. Rosalie pushed her food around more than she ate it. At one point she set her fork down and looked at me directly. "Tomorrow," she said, not a question, a statement. I nodded. "Yes." Baylor glanced between us. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Rosalie didn't look at him. "She said she needs time," she replied, "so I'm giving her tonight." Then finally she met his eyes, but not more than that. Baylor gave a small nod. "That sounds fair," such a simple word. And yet it felt heavier than anything else that had been said all day. Later that night, I sat alone in the study again. The envelope rested in front of me, open now, exposed. There's a difference between something hidden and something revealed. Once it's revealed, even partially, it changes the way it exists. It demands something, and I knew tomorrow it would demand everything. I didn't wait for morning. Some truths are better spoken before they grow heavier. I found Rosalie in the living room. Curled into the corner of the sofa, a blanket loosely around her shoulders, though the room wasn't cold. She looked up as I entered. She didn't smile, not out of anger, just anticipation. "I thought you might come," she said. I sat across from her, not too close. Not distant either, a space that allowed the conversation to breathe. "I don't think waiting until tomorrow will make this easier," I said. She nodded slowly. "I didn't think so either." Baylor stood in the doorway, not intruding, but not absent. Rosalie glanced at him briefly. "You can stay," she said. It wasn't a request. He stepped inside quietly, took a seat nearby, and just like that we were all there. No more distance, no more separate conversations, just truth, or at least the beginning of it. I folded my hands together. Not out of nerves, just to keep them still. "There are parts of my life," I began, "that I chose not to bring forward when I became your mother." Rosalie didn't interrupt. She leaned forward slightly, listening fully. "Not because they didn't matter," I continued, "but because they belonged to a version of me that no longer existed in the same way." Her voice came softly, "But they still existed." "Yes," I said. Baylor remained silent, but I could feel his attention, steady, focused. "Dawson," I said. The name felt different now. Less distant, more present. He was someone I loved. The words settled quietly, no shock, no sudden reaction, just understanding beginning to take shape. Rosalie's eyes didn't leave mine. "How long?" she asked. "A few years," I replied, and it ended, "Yes." "How?" I took a breath. This was the part that mattered, not just what happened, but what followed. "It ended because I left," I said, her brow furrowed slightly. "You left him?" "Yes." "Why?" I hesitated, not to avoid the truth, but to place it carefully. "Because staying would have meant building a life that wasn't stable," I said. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means there were things about that life that I couldn't trust." Rosalie's voice tightened slightly. "And you just walked away?" "No," I said quietly. "I carried it with me for a long time." A pause, long enough to know I had made the right decision. Rosalie leaned back slightly, processing. Then she asked the question that shifted everything. "Did he know about me?" The room felt still, completely still. And in that stillness there was no space left for partial truths. "Yes," I said, her breath caught just slightly. "He knew I existed?" she asked. "Yes." Baylor's posture shifted subtly beside her, not reacting, just absorbing. Rosalie's voice softened. "Before I was born," I nodded. "Yes." Another pause, longer this time, because now the shape of the truth was becoming clearer and more dangerous. "Was he my father?" she asked. The question didn't come out loud. It came out carefully, almost gently, like she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. I held her gaze and I answered her with the same care. "No." The word landed firm, certain, and I saw it. The tension in her shoulders eased just slightly, but not completely, because something still remained. "Then why does this feel like it has something to do with me?" she asked. There it was again, that instinct, that quiet understanding that something was still missing. I looked at her, then at Baylor, then back at her. "Because there was a moment," I said slowly, "when I wasn't sure what the future would look like." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I continued, "that when I left it, I didn't know yet what I was walking toward." Silence then. And when I found out I was pregnant, I said, the room shifted, not loudly, but deeply. Rosalie's eyes widened slightly, Baylor's breath stilled. And for a short time, I added, there was uncertainty. Rosalie's voice came barely above a whisper. Uncertainty about what? I held her gaze. About who your father was. The words didn't echo, they didn't need to, they settled, quiet, heavy, unavoidable. Rosalie didn't move, didn't speak. Her eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, trying to understand what had just been placed in front of her. But you said, she began. I said he's not your father, I replied. And he is. She swallowed, slowly. Then why keep the letter? Because it held the version of me that didn't know, because it carried the weight of that uncertainty, because letting it go felt like pretending that moment never existed. But I didn't say all of that, because some decisions don't erase the paths we almost took, I said, her eyes filled, not with tears but with something else, something more complex. You almost built a life with someone who might have been my father, she said, yes. And you never told me, no, why? The question was soft, but it carried more weight than any of the others. I leaned forward slightly. Because I chose your father, I said, not out of uncertainty but out of clarity. She held my gaze. And you were sure? Yes. A pause. And you've always been sure since? Yes. That part at least had never changed. Rosalie looked down, then back up. And Dawson, she asked, what about him? Did he ever try to find you? The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it touched something I had avoided even within myself. For a while, I said, and then he stopped. Why? I hesitated because the truth wasn't simple. I made it clear that part of my life was over, I said. Rosalie nodded slowly, absorbing, understanding, but not fully settled. Baylor spoke then, for the first time since the conversation began. That explains the letter, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. But it doesn't fully explain why it felt like something more, he added. I looked at him, then back at Rosalie. Because, I said, even when something is resolved, the memory of not knowing doesn't disappear. Rosalie exhaled slowly, and for a moment the tension in the room shifted. Not gone, but understood, at least partially. She leaned back into the sofa, pulled the blanket closer around her, and looked at me in a way she hadn't before, not as a daughter looking at her mother, but as a person seeing another person more clearly. You should have told me, she said. I nodded. Yes, a small pause, I know. And in that moment the truth had finally been spoken, not perfectly, not completely without consequence, but honestly. And sometimes that's the only way forward. But even as the room settled, even as the weight of silence shifted into something more manageable, I couldn't shake one quiet thought, because something still didn't sit right, not in what I had said, but in what Baylor had felt from the beginning, that sense that this wasn't entirely in the past. And for the first time, I found myself wondering if there was something I hadn't seen, something I had missed, something that hadn't stayed where I thought I left it. And that thought stayed with me long after the conversation ended.